Hello and welcome back to my channel. My name is Nicole and let's talk about some books. So this week is going to be a little bit different than some of my other weekly reading wrap-ups, just in terms of how I compiled the list of books that I'm reading. So in the month of June, I used my TBR game to pick my books for the month, but unlike in previous months, I actually created mini TBRs for each week. So this week I decided to read all the books that fit into the category of something that I recently hauled, and for the sakes and purposes of this week, that just means I need to have hauled the book at some point in 2025. So here are the books that I ended up reading and working through this week, and I'm going to review them for you, telling you what my thoughts were on them, what they were about, who I think might also enjoy this book, perhaps even more than I did. So I'm going to go ahead and start with the first book, which is Dawn. You did see this on my May wrap-up where I had read it in just the last couple of days of May. However, I have not reviewed this book yet, so I am going to do that for you right now. And I will try not to wave the book around because I've realized that that causes my camera to flash all sorts of funny, so I apologize for that, but I'm working on it. Dawn is a work of science fiction by Octavia E. Butler. It is the first book in what I believe is a trilogy, which is called Lilith's Brood. And Dawn is appropriately named as it is about a young woman named Lilith. Lilith has awoken in a strange room with very little memory of her past other than the attempted destruction of humanity on Earth. And in this room, she does realize that she has awakened multiple times, which just means she's woken up with not a lot of memory of how she got to where she was, but quite a bit of memory of previous awakenings. On her third awakening, however, she does end up staying awake, and she ends up finding that she is now in a position where she has to make a choice. And that choice is to either cooperate with her captives or rescuers or whatever she determines they are to be, to start planning her escape. But first, she has to figure out where she is. It does kind of remind me of the start of Project Hail Mary. So if you liked that kind of beginning, you might like this. There is no actual amnesia trope in here, however, so if that's something you don't like, don't worry, that's not going to happen. I really enjoyed this book. I felt like Octavia E. Butler in this novel was really trying to get you to experience what xenophobia really is and to communicate that sense of otherness, why we can be afraid of it, how we can overcome it, whether that's always a good thing or not. And this book dives into so many fascinating topics, as do all of Octavia E. Butler's works, in my opinion. She talks about, like I mentioned, xenophobia, but she also talks about the idea of humanity. What does it mean to be human? At which point do we cease to be human? Like any good sci-fi, she gets into topics related to trust issues and betrayal and backstabbing and loyalty and manipulation, and human relationships and relationships in general are all involved in this book. And it was just so well done. To me, one of the things that I think Octavia does the best in her writing is she just talks about so many dynamic themes that you may not expect to find in science fiction. I do at this point, but I don't know. She's definitely not writing just commercial fiction. There is always some sort of philosophical element or discussion in her books, and I really appreciate that. I think that her writing, however, does tend to be very commercial, very approachable, very easy to read, very engaging storytelling, and she uses all of that to great effect to really get you as a reader to answer for yourself the questions that are being asked in the book. Whether those questions are being asked of the protagonist or by the protagonist or the antagonist, it doesn't matter. You find yourself pondering these deep questions throughout the entire book. But there's still a lot of action and character building that you can also just appreciate it as a really well done story. The only thing that I would critique about Octavia's writing, and particularly Dawn, is that there are definitely moments in here that can get kind of weird. I like her storytelling because it's unique, and I feel like, Forrest Gump style box of chocolate, you never know what you're going to get, but you really never know what you're going to get. And there were definitely some moments in here that I was like, oh, okay, that's different, and oh, that's a little weird. This book is a great work of science fiction, and I think it would be enjoyed by anybody who likes sci-fi that tends to have a focus on humanity and discussions of what's going to happen to humans and human life on Earth, and how we can work that out. It's a little bit dystopic in theme, though it's not really about dystopia or like the world gone wrong in that sense. That's not really the focus of the book. I also think you would enjoy this book if you like character-based novels. There is a plot in here, but it's definitely secondary to all the characters that she builds up. I think Octavia E. Butler is a master at building characters, though I will say from book to book to book, they do feel somewhat similar, but not in a bad way because I really enjoy her characters. So I don't mind that they seem to kind of appear under different names in all of her works. I think this is also a really good book for anybody who just really likes a unique story. I have yet to read any other science fiction that I feel like the plot is exactly like hers. I think she is just really innovative in her storytelling and her plot lines. My husband does tend to relate them all to this one video game that he loves, but I think that's more his associations than what's really going on in the book. But I don't know. I don't read a ton of science fiction, so maybe don't take my word for it on that. I did end up giving this book 5 stars. However, I'm starting to get to the point where I'm thinking about sort of walking away from star ratings, even though I recently released to my members a video about updating my star ratings. But maybe that's not so at odds with how I'm feeling. I'm just feeling like my star ratings are very personal to me, but don't necessarily reflect whether or not I think other people would enjoy this book or any of the books that I recommend. Anyway, it was a 5 star read for me. I would recommend it to people who liked character-based science fiction about humanity and what it means to be a human. I feel like there's some philosophical term that describes that entire discussion, but it's beyond me what it is. Anyway, if you like those things, you might like this book just as much as I did. And you might like the next book I talk about as well, but for totally different reasons, because I don't feel like there's a lot of correlation between these two books. So the next book that I read is Sour Cherry, a novel by Natalia Theodoridou. Is that right? I need to look that up. That's probably super wrong. I'm sorry. I really need to put more energy and effort into pronouncing people's last names correctly because people say my last name wrong all the time. Anyway, also, okay, sidebar. Not anyway. Let's just go back more into this title. A novel. Why do so many books mention that they're a novel now? Is it that unclear, the distinction between a novel and other types of writing? I'm a little confused by this. Like it's starting to become on the cover of lots of books, almost every book that's a novel, I feel like. Anyway, Sour Cherry. What is this book about? This is such a strange, weird book. I read it, I enjoyed it, I think, and I really had to sit with it for a while at the end and think about what I just read and what just happened to me while I was reading and what the experience actually was. I did enjoy it, I guess. Let me see if I can tell you what this book is about and what it was like reading it. So, Sour Cherry is a story, a novel, that is told by an unnamed narrator. The narrator is spending the course of the book telling what they call a fairy tale to their also equally unnamed audience. And it is a intimate story from one person to another where they are focusing on trying to, as carefully as possible, communicate to them a fairy tale that may be their actual experience or someone else's experience. It's a little unclear, and that's intentional. And the fairy tale they share is horrible and gothic and atmospheric and creepy and tells a story of a man who feels more like a monster and maybe is a monster. That part's definitely not clear. And it tells a story of this guy as he goes along with his overly long fingernails. There was a lot of discussion of very long fingernails, and his strange characteristics and his horrible behavior towards the women that he leaves behind as ghosts, as well as the devastation he brings to the land around him. It's very allegorical, gothic, and weird in nature. If you like your horror to not necessarily be scary, but to be dark and strange, this may be the book for you. I would say the things that this book is really trying to get you to experience and understand is both that feeling of trying to communicate an idea to somebody, but having to do it indirectly, in some ways to protect yourself and those in the story, as well as trying to protect the person who is hearing your story. It is almost like a major content warning is surrounding the narrative here. And this story also talks about human and character development, storytelling, fairy tales, the way we tell and communicate with one another. as well as the dark sides of relationships. It is a really interesting story. Even the structure of the novel is really interesting. You can see maybe as I flip the pages that there are pages here and there that are bordered in black. Formatting comes into play in the structure of this story because you have almost kind of two timelines going on, or two narratives happening. One is the narrative of the unnamed narrator telling sort of the backstory about how they got to the situation that they're in. And the pages that are covered with a black border have to do with what is going on in the present in their lives. The idea is that this narrator is telling the story over a course of probably about one day, and it's almost as a flashback, but they swear it's really a fairy tale. And yeah, you're kind of, as a reader, sort of mixed in all of that and trying to sparse the truth for yourself. So, what are the highs of this book? For me, I think the thing that I appreciated the most was actually the narrative structure and the formatting of the book. I thought it was really fascinating, and it was a really unique way of telling a story, just drawing you back and forth into the present and the past and kind of blending them together and making you question the truth, the veracity, and the reality of the story that was being told. Like, where was the present? Who is this narrator? Who are they talking to? All of that got to ask you like questions and kept me invested in the story. It was also very atmospheric. There was a lot of attention paid to the details of setting and time and place, even though some of it you're like, is that really when this is happening? And I appreciated the fact that the narrative voice also would bring these things up to the audience, which sometimes feels like you. There are parts that are told in second person where there's moments where they're like, you probably don't believe what I'm saying. And I'm like, yeah, I don't know if I do. So I enjoyed that aspect. I know like second person narration can be hit or miss for people, so that is something to consider in the enjoyment of this story, but I really liked how it was done. I think if there was any low in this story, it would definitely be a personal preference. I tend to like symbols and themes to be fleshed out at some point in my story. Did feel like that while there was a lot of symbolism used in this book, a lot of it was kept too obscure or was left off until the end to be explained. And so I did find myself at the end of the book still with a lot of questions, still wondering if I understood what happened, which in some aspects, in terms of who the implied audience is, makes sense. But in other ways, I just found really confusing and unsettling, and I'm not sure in the way that the author intended. But again, I'm also aware that I tend to like most of my symbolism in a book like pretty explicitly explained. So that is a personal preference. It may be something that doesn't bother you as a reader at all. So this is a great book for anybody who likes that gothic, atmospheric, sort of dark, creepy setting in a book. It's a good book for anybody who doesn't mind exploring the darker sides of relationships. If you like sort of weird and sometimes gross things in your book, or you don't mind those in your stories, this would be good for you. While it's classified as a horror, I think it's sort of like a literary fiction type of horror where I did personally didn't find it scary, and I am a major scaredy cat. So that was a good thing for me, but if you like your horror to scare you, this probably won't. But if you like your horror to be a little bit of body horror and a little bit of, gross accounting of things, this definitely gets that. It also gets the horror vibes and feel, I feel like, in terms of setting. And this would be a good book for somebody who doesn't need all the answers, who doesn't mind if the symbolism in their book isn't always explained, if you like to fill in the gaps and fill in the things and sit at the end of the story and go, oh, I think this is all that really happened, da, 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 and fill in all the blanks. That would be a good book for you. For me, this ended up getting 4 stars, and mainly because I'm not necessarily that last person I talked about, which is no knock to the book. Again, star rating, really personal preference. If you are interested in the book based on what I told you about it, then it's something that is worth checking out. And the third book that I read this week came as quite a surprise to me in terms of how much I enjoyed it. I've had 2 books on my list this week that were both, at least initially, published by independent publishers and are both books that I've heard no one talk about. Sour Cherry was actually published just this year and is put out by Tin House Press, and I really think is a book that should hopefully get a lot of traction. I think people who like horror or that sort of literary feeling horror gothic kind of vibe, I think people who like those types of things or don't mind weird horror will probably really like this book and should give it a try. The next book I have was also originally published by Independent Press. I forget which, so I will put it up on the screen. And that book is The Inevitable by Daniel Hope. This book was so good, guys. It exceeded my expectations and my hopes. And I'm just going to tell you right at the front, I gave it 5 stars. I really enjoyed this book and this story. Like it was like a huggable ending. It gave me everything I wanted. It was funny, it was sad, it was deep. And let me tell you what The Inevitable is about. So this tells the story of Tuck, who is one of the last robots in the galaxy, the universe. The how does that even work? In the universe, I guess. And he has survived the bot riots that happened back on Earth, and he is now traversing the universe trying to find spare parts so that he can keep himself and his AI companion going. And this is just a really touching story that talks about Tuck's fight to survive in a world where he is now nothing but a collectible of things past. In fact, he's trying to outrun collectors while also collecting spare parts. There's a lot of collection happening. There were a lot of highs in this book, but I have to say that one of them for sure was the characters. In this book are what keep you coming back over and over again. You care about them, you enjoy listening to their conversation, you hate some of them, you want to know what's going to happen. The plot is so engaging and well paced that you like it keeps you moving through the story. And then the themes are what gets you in the end. Get deeper than what you might expect. There is some lighthearted feeling to this book, even though the central idea that it talks about in Tuck's life is rather deep and probably more unsettling to some. There is a lot of discussion in this book about, again, humanity, which I think is really interesting, but more than anything, mortality. The idea of what does it mean to be alive, what is life, and what exactly is death. So I would say that if talking about death makes you uncomfortable, this may be a difficult book for you, but if you're open to it, I think it is such a really well done conversation about death and life and the meaning of both and how we can find meaning in them and all of those things. In fact, in that sense, it in some ways reminded me of the Midnight Library, but so much better done in terms of just like incorporating a discussion on a heavy topic within a book. There were things that I loved about this book in terms of like there are Star Trek references. It does kind of feel like your sort of typical Star Trek meets Marvel outer space character type of feel, where you get a little bit of that like offhand funny characters in it. So if you think of Star Trek and like Marvel and some of the like funnier, quirky characters that are in those stories, this book is full of people like that, and I loved it. I have learned that I don't tend to like my science fiction to be super heavy. This wasn't. I think it struck a really good balance, and I really think more people need to read this book. The only negative thing that I really have to say about this book is that I did think that there were a few editing things that needed to be straightened out. There were a couple of lines that were repeated a little too much, and there were a couple of moments where things were like over explained. And I just wish those had have been cleaned up in editing a bit more, but they're few and far in between, and by and large, easy to overlook because everything else about this book is so interesting and exciting. So, if you are looking for a book that is about AI, that is about robots, that is about the idea of autonomous robots and what that might mean for humanity and what it means if a robot or AI gets self-awareness. What does that mean in terms of our understanding of life and mortality and how they themselves might perceive that, or you want to think about your own mortality? This is a great way to do it, in my opinion. Is also a great read for those who love found family. I mean, the book is dedicated to found family, so I don't know how much more of that you could be looking for. It is a book where there is a lot of like fun action in it, like blaster fights and all the like. So if you like that kind of just fun action, it reminds me a bit of the lightheartedness that you can get in John Scalzi. If you don't like that kind of thing in your science fiction, then you might not like this book. But I just think it is a good book for people who like sort of more quirky science fiction. Another one I think of is Project Hail Mary. So I've listed a lot of books that this reminds me of, but not plot-wise. I actually thought the plot in this was pretty unique in some ways, and I really enjoyed it. I gave it a 5 star. Did I say that? Like it should be obvious at this point. I really enjoyed that book. And that's it. Those are the 3 books that I read this week. I really had a really good reading week with these 3, and I just decided to keep going. I did start another recently hauled book, and that is The Fifth Business, which is part of the Deptford trilogy. I will go into that once I finish it. I thought I was going to have enough time to finish the book, and really I would have if it was as interesting as I was hoping it was going to be. So there's a little sneak peek on my thoughts of how that's going. I am also still working through Clarissa. I have started my June letters, and I will put up on the screen what my song of the week is from Year of Wonders. That is it for me. That's how my reading week went this week. What am I even trying to say? And what was that sentence? I don't know. But I read a lot of recently hauled books this week, and given that I just recently unhauled some books, as well as have been reading some TBR vets recently, I'm feeling pretty happy with how things went. Like, so far, I can say that very likely 3 of the 4 books that I recently hauled were 4 or 5 star reads for me. This one now is coming pretty close to being DNF'd, so I don't know what that means. But I feel like that's a pretty decent win, seeing as how when I did my TBR vets, the last time I did a whole week of those, I think my average rating was somewhere around a 3. So I'm hoping this means that I'm getting better at picking out books that I will thoroughly enjoy, and hopefully this trend continues. And yeah, we'll see how things go from there. Let me know how your week went with your reading. Why am I putting all those words together? I'm making tongue twisters for myself. Anyway, let me know what you read, and I'll talk to you next time. Bye. That is it for me. That is how my weekly reading week went. That is it for me. That's how my reading week went this week. Let me know how your week went with your reading.